and welcome to today's webinar on Drive Smarter Experimentation and Personalization with Fully Integrated Data. I'm Megan Winnery, Senior Demand Gen Manager at Telium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. This webinar will last approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded, and the slides and the recording of the presentation will be made available at the end of the session. And please note that you'll find some related resources in the attachments section that you can view during or after the webinar. And we want to hear your questions, so please use the questions feature to submit them. And for any that we aren't able to answer live, we'll follow up with you after the presentation is over. And lastly, you'll see the social hashtag for today's webinar in the lower right-hand corner of our deck, hashtag Telium Personalization Webinar. We encourage you to retweet, like, and share as we live tweet throughout the webinar. All right, on to today's presenter. Kyle Brierly is Director, Global Integrated Solutions at Telium and is responsible for building powerful new platform integrations and strategic partnerships. The Integrated Solutions team works with customers and technology partners to develop real-time customer data solutions that help solve unique and complex digital marketing challenges. Kyle joined Telium in 2016 and has 10+ years of experience in marketing and advertising technology, with an extensive background in programmatic and advertising operations on both the buy and sell sides. All right, let's get started. Kyle, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Megan, and thank you guys for joining. So today we're talking about experimentation and creating great customer experiences. And we feel like there's a lot of content out there that talks about high-level strategy and sort of getting buy-in from the broader organization. But as we move through Q4 and into Q1, a lot of companies are thinking about, okay, in 2019, we really want to lock this down. We really want to drive some better experiences. We want to solve for these problems. And one piece that I wanted to touch on today is sort of the technology stack that drives that whole operation. Because a lot of times companies will end up buying maybe too many platforms or not the right ones, and then maybe deploying them or implementing them in a way that isn't totally strategic. So what we're going to look at is, are there ways that you can more intelligently integrate the technology in your stack in order to drive a better experience? So for this slide here, right, buying technology is easy. There's a lot of companies out there that market that they have kind of a silver bullet that can sort of solve the problem of the customer experience. But, sort of spray and pray or, buying and crossing your fingers and hoping it's going to work isn't necessarily the right thing to do. Making it work for your company is definitely hard. What ends up happening is, you'll buy a bunch of different technology, and if it's not talking to each other, if it's not integrated properly, you end up with different views of your customer in each of these respective endpoint solutions, right? So in your email platform, this customer looks like a VIP maybe, but in your retargeting platform, this might be just an anonymous user who you don't know. And that can create a disjointed experience for the customer, but it's something that's solvable, right? These technologies can talk to each other. And internally, when your platforms aren't talking to each other, it's sort of downstream, the teams working with those technologies end up looking at different data sets. It becomes harder to collaborate, right? Your developers are getting sort of disjointed requests from different teams. Marketing has trouble sort of cross-correlating data between their different tools. And then the data science team, maybe they're looking at similar data sets, but that are hard to correlate based on easy little fixes, right? Event underscore name versus event dot name. Just different data coming from different platforms. I was looking at the Bain & Company study that came out this year in 2018, and one of the things that stood out to me was that they were looking at the most successful enterprise companies. What are the characteristics of those companies in driving great experiences? And one of the things was sort of a higher level of investment in a smaller number of technologies versus a limited level of investment in a lot of different technologies. A lot of times you've got overlapping functionality between these different technologies, but you kind of maybe buy one more tool because it sounds like it's going to solve the problem. So what we're going to look at today is, can we sort of dive into the technology that we have and make it work better, basically. The ultimate goal, obviously, is putting the customer, the end user for your brand, at the center of the whole experience, right? You want unified data sets that sort of join together all of the touch points that are sort of produced by the user interacting with your brand, so that you can accurately and congruently, deliver messaging and the right products to the user in the right context. So universal actions or universal data is sort of the theme for the day. How do we, across all platforms and contexts, take informed action in order to improve the experience with the user? And I figured, how to better explain that than with some corny memes, because I feel like that always helps. And these are terrible, so don't judge me for that. But when the analytics team is looking in GA and you've got data coming in for event name, but it's, like I said earlier, event underscore name or event dot name, camel case, whatever it is, these are small things that, it just because a platform isn't collecting data in the right way, downstream creates a lot of pain when you're trying to do actual reporting and analysis. These are easy fixes though. When your teams are sort of manually uploading data to all these different platforms, or doing too much in Excel, when there's ways to automate these things. A lot of these platforms that we're using to drive these experiences, they have APIs, and they're there for a reason. Maybe it's a skill set issue. You don't have the right people internally in order to sort of build these things out. But a lot of the times the platforms will help sort of guide and direct you on how to use those APIs to sort of automate some of these processes. So we'll look at that later too. And then from the data science perspective, machine learning and AI and all that stuff, we won't go too far into that. But I just pulled this up basically to point out, as you're building your experience operation internally, keep the data in mind as you're sort of deploying and implementing these technologies, right? Because if you don't deploy and collect the data the right way, downstream, you're going to think you're doing data science potentially, but if you're not working with the right data sets, it's going to be impossible to sort of derive any value and create informed actionability off of that data. So what we'll look at is inspecting the factory, and this is kind of a term we use at Helium. It's probably broadly used by you guys as well, but taking a look internally at, okay, what technology do we have? What processes do we have in place? And are there ways that we can improve upon that, right? So we'll dive into that a little bit. Becoming a better experimenter as a company, it's not a snap your fingers and it's done kind of thing. Obviously, there's all kinds of factors that play into, not experimenting or not improving upon the processes. Lack of innovation or not the right skill sets internally, lack of budget, things like that. But again, one of the things that I wanted to touch on is, a poorly integrated stack or opportunities to improve the way that your platforms are talking to each other. The company itself, a lot of us have the same goals, right? We want marketing to be autonomous and be able to act quickly without relying on engineering. Data teams, you want them with the right, clean, standardized data sets so that they can sort of bring informed analysis back to the operations teams. Business and executives, you want them to easily be able to gain insight from the data that's being produced by all these platforms. Product teams for rollouts, you want to be rolling out informed updates and optimizations to the product, not sort of blindly rolling things out in multivariate testing. And then at the end of the day, you want the end user to have a great experience. For the technology, again, the goals are going to be similar, but these are kind of three things that you can, as you're inspecting the factory, start to look at, right? Do you have the ability to collect and standardize data in real time? Is the data integrated across all the endpoint solutions and contexts? And then can you translate that data into actionable insight? For a lot of you, probably 80% of it, yes, but there's always room to improve. Maybe there's an API you didn't know about or a way to automate something you didn't know about. So always be hunting and poking holes in the process internally. So it is, kind of taking a step back, leveling up, going from a noob to a pro in terms of experimentation. Again, this is just kind of a checklist you can go down to look at as you're sort of inspecting the factory, right? Do we have a ton of overlapping technology that's sort of solving for the same problem? That technology that we have, is it, just deployed using vanilla implementation, or is it tested and strategically deployed on the site, right? Because that's an important one too, right? You can, buy a technology, deploy it based off of the, sort of one-on-one instructions that come with it. But if you just set it and let it and, kind of cross your fingers, hope it works, it's typically not going to benefit the company as much as it could be. Those same platforms, do you have a unique schema that sits on top of the collection layer for each platform itself? Or do you have sort of a global data collection schema across all these platforms? Again, for the data teams downstream, if they're trying to sort of ETL data from all these different platforms into one data warehouse, that's extra time and effort that doesn't need to be there if you can unify the data collection across all those platforms. The integration between the platforms, again, there's APIs there for a reason, and a lot of these companies have pre-built integrations, and that's another thing to consider as you're sort of building your stack out, right? Am I buying a technology that plays well with the existing technology in place? The experimentation itself, the changes you're making, are they single-threaded, or are they done sort of in a vacuum of the platform itself? Or are you taking action in the broader context of all the other changes and touch points that the user interacts with? And then lastly, do you have multiple views of your customers, or do you have one view across all your different platforms? And again, this is not like, an overnight fix. This is tough, right? So I wanted to break it down and just take a look at 3 of these sort of sections to see, maybe just throw out some ideas, some food for thought, and hopefully show you guys some stuff that maybe you didn't know. And if you did, we'd love to hear it. And if there's ways to improve that you already know, we'd love to hear that too. So the data collection layer, right? This is kind of the root of all, potential problems and potential successes, right? You got to make sure your data collection across all these different touch points is standardized and as real time as possible. So we're looking at, collecting data. That data correlates to metrics or sort of events that happen within the context of the brand experience, interacting with the customer, and then how do we track those in order to report back on KPIs for the company, right? So first off, collecting the data, we like to use the term the data layer, and this is pretty common across a lot of tag management systems, things like that. But again, it's defining sort of a single global schema that all of your data produced by the customer interacting with your brand is going to abide by, essentially. So it's one definition standardized across all these collection points. That data, as it's being produced, you're looking to track, these different metrics or events that are happening with the brand on your website or in your app, things like that. So these are, this is way too long, don't read, but there's all kinds of different things you could be tracking, but you want to make sure that the data tied to these events, again, is standardized, right? So it doesn't matter if it's an app install of your app or like a download of a white paper on your website. You want to make sure that for each of those contexts, you're grabbing the same data and it's standardized across both platforms. The KPIs tied to that, these are going to be unique to every company, right? But a lot of them are pretty similar, right? We're trying to drive revenue, we're trying to drive subscriptions, things like that. But in order to sort of optimize towards these KPIs, if you're struggling to sort of report back on the metrics and the data tied to those KPIs, it's going to be tough to sort of make optimizations that make sense, right? No data source left behind. So, once you've kind of figured out, okay, we've got the schema in place, we know what metrics we're trying to track, and the data that's going to be tied to each of those, and you'll know your KPIs, obviously. One thing to point out or to think about is, are there sources of data that you're struggling to collect from, right? So is it, call center data where there's an interaction over the phone, and then you're manually exporting that data after the fact when maybe there's an API that can be delivering that data in real time to other endpoint solutions? Or do you have like a single page application that maybe you don't have the right SDK for, things like that. Even for your endpoint solutions, a lot of the times there's ways to, trigger webhooks to deliver data out on certain events, right? So if, let's say things like somebody just opening an email that you sent out is a metric that you want to track that sort of ties to a KPI of, like a lead score or something like that. Taking a look at, does your ESB have the ability to trigger a webhook on email open to deliver data out of that platform to your other solutions, things like that. So just kind of exploring, are there better ways to collect this data from all these different contexts? And then past that, so you've kind of figured out, okay, I know where I need to get all this data from, right? My website, my mobile app, all these different offline sources. The one thing I wanted to call out is now we can start thinking about, are there additional data points that maybe you're not collecting right now? And specifically, I wanted to call out sort of metadata broadly. It's one thing to collect, we've got page name, we've got event name, we've got URL, all that stuff standardized and collected. But for those interactions with the user, can we also collect the metadata that's being produced by the endpoint solutions? So we can even further tie these platforms together, right? So if you're using like a personalization platform, right? The user hits the site and an event happens, are you grabbing the variation ID, the campaign ID, the experiment ID, things like that, so that downstream, you're not necessarily running just an analysis on, the analytics or clickstream level data, but it's that data tied to and correlated to changes and optimizations that you're making, so that over time, you've got this nice sequence of data that sort of lines up to all the changes that you're making. The other thing too is, I have vendor data down there, but a lot of times each of these vendor platforms will produce unique data points that seemingly are only sort of available within the platform itself. But on, an example coming up, like there's things like if you're using a session replay vendor, can you use the JavaScript API to grab the actual URL of that replay session while the user's on the site and ties that to all the other data you're collecting? So again, thinking about, are there data points that would be useful down the road when we're looking at the data that we can, set up or code out on the site to grab now? There's all these cool things you can do, and a lot of the times maybe it's not documented very well, or it's just unclear how to get those data points, but the vendors are, love talking about this stuff and love to help. So, and this is kind of the end goal, right? So we pulled this up earlier, the single view of the customer. Obviously you want, a unified look across all your platforms, but then you take it a level further and it's a single view of the customer tied to the context and the metadata being produced by the vendor platforms, because that's sort of driving that experience. Connecting the pipes. So we talked about data collection, that was the first one. So now we'll talk about integration. And this first example is kind of what I was talking about, right? Tying that metadata to the actual deployment of the technologies and the activation of the data itself. So I want to walk you through a scenario that I think is pretty cool, and it kind of touches on a few different things we've talked about already, but I'll walk you through this left to right. So the idea here is this is like a client side, on your website, a deployment of multiple technologies, and how do we integrate them and collect all the right data and then activate it in real time. So this is sort of a step or two beyond what would be sort of the vanilla implementation that we were talking about earlier. But so let's go through it, right? User hits the website. If you've got sort of a single point of collection and you have that single view of the customer already set up, can you, run an API to bring back that visitor's profile so it's available on the website? So immediately you have the ability to better personalize or better drive the experience because you know who's on the site. So you've got, different data points tied to that visitor's profile and different identifiers. Because we know who this is, so for the fire logic for the different technologies, right, we know, okay, this is a VIP customer, and we know they're high value. So because of those two things, let's go ahead and fire our personalization vendors client-side tag. Let's fire our session replay tag because we want to, capture the sessions of our best customers. And then maybe we're not going to fire our retargeting tag because most of the time this person buys, so we don't need to waste ad dollars. And so this user's shopping around, we'll call it an e-commerce example. User shopping around, and then during that experience, they start, I love this term, but they start like rage clicking on a button that's not working, right? They've already added some stuff to the cart, and maybe this new variation had changed the checkout button or something like that. They're clicking, it's not working, and they end up abandoning. But on that event, what's crucial is you'll see, and this is a little bit hard to see, but the data that we're collecting, yeah, we can grab that they're a cart abandoner. Yeah, we can grab the URL, the products in the cart. But let's also grab, for that event, up on the top, what was that variation? What was that experiment? Can we get that replay session URL? And then what was the event, right? Like a struggle event. So now that we have that data tied to everything else in the data layer that we're collecting, what can you do with that? Well, two things primarily, or that we'll focus on, but one is now you've got that data all in one event that can be reported on and analyzed later, right? So downstream, the data teams will have that all tied together. But then think about the other use cases for that too. Like if you rolled out a variation that's causing your best customers to struggle to buy things on your website, if you had also rolled out a similar variation in your newsletter or an email campaign, wouldn't you want to remove that user from that email campaign because it's sort of causing hiccups? So, leveraging the APIs to, either remove that user from a list that that campaign is being delivered from, or maybe updating your CRM to say, this user just had a struggle event and is a great customer, and then your customer service team can maybe give them a call because you have their information, things like that. The ability to, take that data, tie it to everything you know about that user, and then take action on it immediately becomes super valuable. And so this is a bit oversimplified in terms of how it's actually deployed, and we can kind of go through questions and stuff afterwards. But I like this one because it takes it from, just deploying your session replay vendor's JavaScript and then recording every session and then logging into that platform and hunting through sessions to find the struggle events. Now you've got everything tied in one database on the back end, and you're able to act on it in real time too. So it's just kind of a cool way to sort of like level up that use case. Another one too, in terms of, we're talking about the integration itself right now, but in a mobile environment, this is another one that I see a lot of opportunity to improve on is managing multiple vendors within your app within that context, right? So taking a similar example, if you have a unified data collection strategy, and ideally is just sort of a single point of data collection and management of those vendor technologies, what ideally you get is within your app, you've got one single SDK that's either remote loading or sort of bridge loading your other vendor SDKs, or if that SDK needs to be placed natively, you can still have one single SDK for data collection, managing all the track calls for the other vendors, right? But the idea is you want all those SDKs, just like in the client-side example, you want all those SDKs to be collecting the same exact data sets. So if you control that from one SDK versus trying to individually code that out in every SDK, it removes a lot of room for human error, right? Where marketing sort of goes to engineering and says, hey, we need this new SDK deployed with, these 15 track calls for these 15 events, things like that. There's a lot of room for slip up. Again, back to like event_name versus event.name, things like that. And then again, working left to right, if you've got that single point of collection, a user action will get taken, whether it's a struggle event, purchase, whatever it is. Single point of data collection, you're grabbing everything, and then in real time, using the APIs of your vendors to deliver that data so that, again, analytics has the same data, your email platform has the same data, and then ultimately your data teams are looking at the sort of unified data set and not trying to ETL all this stuff from these different platforms, basically. Informed action, right? So this is the last one. So we've got data collection figured out. We're starting to think about integrating these technologies, and then, in terms of optimizing the experience for the customer, how do we go from just sort of blindly rolling tests out or just kind of creating variations for the sake of variations to looking at the data historically and in real time to drive better optimizations and, faster adjustments to improve the experience. So a good way to think about the data that's being produced from the experience itself is sort of structured and semi-structured data sets. And depending on where you're at in sort of your, let's call it data orchestration maturity, you may or may not be dealing with these types of data sets right now. But what I wanted to call out is a lot of your platforms are able to produce data in these two formats that are very easy to work with. And there's different use cases for both. But what I wanted to call out is, again, this idea of adding in this additional metadata tied to a unified collection strategy is going to produce better results for both types of data sets, right? So we've got on the left the new inclusions, right? So we're talking about what was the experiment, what was the variation. I didn't talk about this too much, but grabbing the actual identifiers for the users from each of these platforms. Again, if you're looking at a data set downstream, and for each user, you've got the ID for each respective platform that you're using to drive the experience, it's going to make it way easier to go back in and make adjustments on a per user basis or a per audience basis or per segment versus trying to sort of take broad strokes of adjustments that maybe don't make sense for certain individuals. The metadata, again, things like the session replay URL, the variation IDs, things like that. And then anything else unique that that platform might sort of produce or make available within that context. The benefits downstream, again, you've got a unified set of data, all that clickstream sort of analytics type data, but now it's tied to stuff that's unique to those platforms. So you can run all the usual adjustments and analysis that you would usually do, without those technologies. But now you can take that same data set and apply it to the sort of day-to-day operations within each of those platforms. The visitor profile itself now, assuming you've got like a data warehouse or a lake set up, is sort of persisting these data points over time to where you can look back and see how the changes you're making to the experience are impacting the visitors at each of those changes. And then ultimately, especially for the marketing teams, but you want the adjustments you're making to be super easy and almost no-brainers. So we'll go through just a couple different examples of the types of analysis, but you think about cross-device, and this one's tough too, especially sort of tying a user together across those environments can be tough if you're not driving like authentication or users aren't logging in. But even at that point, I mean, if you're optimizing or experimenting across these different environments, they're very unique experiences. But again, if you're not able to collect the right data points on these sort of struggle events or on successful, increases in purchases, it's really tough to analyze, what was the impact going between these two devices and, for a given set of users, like maybe my best customers, the same experience that I roll out across both platforms isn't going to make sense for that group. But if you collect the right data set, you can start to dial it back in and say, okay, these groups of users need this type of experience on this device, this other group needs this other experience on this other device, things like that. Again, it's just adding a layer to the typical analysis that you do on the back end. Channel analysis, this one's interesting too. This kind of goes back to the first example about the struggle event, but typical channel analysis is looking at things, like UTM parameters, how good was the experience depending on where the user came from, and sort of creating some level of attribution across these different channels. But when you think about all the different areas that you're experimenting with the experience itself, you're rolling out different display ads, you're rolling out different email creatives, maybe even different phone scripts for your call center, things like that. Looking at the impact of those changes for the user and the events that are being produced from the interaction, over time and between those different channels, becomes way more impactful if you're able to tie, not just the fact that this experience on my website didn't perform well for users that came from email, but now it's this experiment didn't perform well because of this variation that we rolled out in email for the users that were sort of clicking through the website. And you can sort of dial it in even further to the actual variation or the actual experience change and make those adjustments per channel. Lifecycle analysis. So, looking at sort of this value and growth of your customer base over time, this is one that everybody's going to be looking at basically, but that value over time for either, a given user or a group of users, it's one thing to sort of track, the total lifetime value of a customer over time, but tying that into, what were the changes and fluctuations of that value for a given time series tied to different rollouts that we did. Being able to go back and look at, hey, 3 months ago, remember when we rolled out that new button, we saw a huge diff with this group of users in terms of purchases, allows you to make much more informed actions. And then finally, sort of clickstream level or attribution analysis. Again, I like to think of this in the context of channel analysis too, but again, the ability for every data point that's produced or every event that's produced by the interaction with the user, if you're able to grab all that metadata that's produced by those platforms, it allows you to really easily dial it in and track where things went wrong or where things went right. If you've got this, massive data set with all kinds of different data points, but if you know what to look for and you collected the right stuff, it makes it way easier to sort of manage downstream. So at the end of the day, again, we're inspecting the factory, but it's just taking a look at, are there ways to better integrate your technology stack and provide better data to those platforms in order to drive a better experience. And again, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, right? There's all kinds of other factors that play into driving a great experience, creative, the strategy itself, training, things like that. But, taking a look at the tech that you have, is it deployed the right way? Is it implemented the right way? Can we integrate things better? It'll go a long way. And even if it's, moving the needle just a little bit, it always helps, right? And then, Telium is a vendor platform, so kind of breaking the fourth wall of the presentation here, but platforms like hearing, feedback from the clients. If there's ideas that you have when you're sort of developing the strategy or kind of moonshot ideas for data points that you want to collect, we want to hear about it, because maybe there's something we can build that will allow you to run a better analysis. So don't be shy with those ideas. We always enjoy talking shop and whiteboarding this type of stuff out, because if our technology works better and creates a better ability for you to drive great experiences, we all win. So, and that is my presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyle. All right, let's take some questions from the audience. So at this time, if you have any questions, please enter them in the questions feature. All right, Kyle, first question. Of the two approaches to storing customer data, do platforms like Telium's integrate into a data warehouse or a data lake?
That's a great question. The two data approaches, right? So we talked about sort of semi-structured or unstructured data versus structured data sets, like a Postgres database or a SQL database. There's different use cases for both. And yeah, so Telium does have sort of products to produce data in both of those formats. Typically, semi or unstructured data sets are great for sort of that time series analysis where you want to see every single event and all the data tied to each event. Allows you to run, over time, how do I attribute these changes to the experience to either upticks or downticks in performance. The queryable or structured data sets are great for looking at, at any given point in time, it'll give you sort of the most up-to-date set of data for your users or the event level data, but looking at things like, okay, why are my group of VIP customers all of a sudden this month purchasing 15% less? Let's look at all the variations they've seen. Let's look at all the different experiments that we're running that user group has seen. And then you could even say, okay, for this given user group that I know is underperforming based on historicals, let me grab, using our example, let me grab those session replay URLs for the last 5 sessions for this group of users, things like that. So it allows you to just dive directly into the data and, quickly identify those problem areas. But yeah, so Telium does have products that sort of support both use cases. And again, it depends on what you're looking to do, but there's use cases for both.
Great, thank you very much. All right, next question. You mentioned that having a unified data approach will allow for better customer experiences. What is a unified data approach, and how do I implement one in my own organization?
Yes, again, great question. Unified data approach, I guess in the simplest sense, is collecting data in the same way across any touch point that's going to produce data, basically. So, you want to, again, it comes back to, defining the schema for how you collect data, and then making sure all of your endpoint solutions and anything that's storing data, essentially, about your customers is using the same data set, basically. And what that allows for is, it's kind of a simple example. It's kind of rare, but, somebody coming to your mobile app and you're, getting treated like they're an anonymous customer when they were just in store a week ago and bought, 15 things, or on the website, getting treated like you're a low value customer when in reality, you buy all the time, things like that. But if it's, again, it's not typical, but if it's because the endpoint solutions that are driving that experience don't have a unified data set that they're working off of, that's an easy thing to fix. So it's, it's a big task, but it's relatively simple when you think about it. It's just collecting standardized data and making sure you're activating it in real time.
Perfect. All right, well, that looks like all the questions we have for today. If you have any additional questions, please submit them, and we'll follow up with you after the webinar. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Kyle, thanks for all of the great information.
Yeah, thanks.